أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وتولى عنهم وقال يا أسفا على يوسف وابيضت عيناه من الحزن فهو كظيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي فالحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. ما بعد everyone, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. I'm going to start by translating ayah number 84 of Surah Yusuf. It's describing the sentiments of Yaqub alayhi salam after he got this news and after he shared the hope that he has that his family will be reunited if he can just exhibit beautiful patience. That's something we read about last time. وَتَوَلَّى عَنْهُمْ, and he turned away from them, meaning his sons. So the scene is they're in the house, they've given him this news, they've had this exchange, and now he no longer wants to continue conversing with them, so he turns his back from them, and he's as if he's walking away. وَقَالَ يَا أَسَفَا عَلَى يُوسُفَ, and he said, oh, my grief, oh, my sadness over Yusuf, my pain, my sorrow, my anger, my sadness over Yusuf. We'll come back to that. Right now it's a shallow translation. وَبْيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ, and his eyes turned white. Both his eyes turned white. مِنَ الْحُزْنِ, out of sadness. فَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ, so, or for, he was swallowing, or he was one that swallows or bottles up. So there's lots of ambiguous language here that if you translate literally, you get some sense of what's being said, but a lot of the power of what's being expressed needs some explanation in English. So I hope to accomplish some of that, inshallah, in today's conversation. The first thing that is worthy of notice is that Allah mentioned and saw it significant to mention that he turned away from them. And this is important because when you are overwhelmed in a conversation and you are hurt, then it is completely okay for you to turn away from those that you are not able to deal with in a reasonable way. And so he's no longer engaging his sons in conversation, even though moments later, the conversation is actually going to continue. Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi's opinion was actually that he got so upset with them that he turned away and he kind of went into a different room and he wasn't even talking to them anymore. But another plausible reading is they're having this conversation with him, they're in the same room, and he turns his back, and as he's walking away from them, he's expressing his own emotion. So he's not talking to them. He's almost a world in and of himself, talking to himself. Though they can hear him, but he's saying this to himself. So he's no longer engaged with them in conversation. This is actually the height of hopelessness with people, right? So he expressed this remarkable hope with Allah in the last ayah. And right after that, Allah describes how he's turning his back from them as if there's nothing good that will come out of talking to you any further. And there's nothing I can say that's productive. So even if he's not dismissing this claim this time, he's seen it, he's pointed out enough of the wrong, like the fact that they were so sure that their brother stole. He's seen enough of the wrong that they do that he doesn't see a point in continuing conversation with them. This is a time that he needs to be alone. وَتَوَلَّى عَنْهُمْ. And there's no guilt in needing some time to yourself. There's no guilt in distancing yourself from a difficult situation and to just turn your back. And sometimes that is necessary. So, تَوَلَّى عَنْهُمْ. وَقَالَ يَا أَسَفَا, and he said, Ya Asafa. Now, phonetically, Asaf and Yusuf sound very phonetically close to each other. And this is actually a feature of Arabic rhetoric where two words that are spelled in a similar way are used artistically together. And this is done very beautifully in the Quran here. But the thing is, when usually wordplay like that is done in poetry or in speech and things like that, then the spelling is the first consideration. Like people are, more concerned about saying words in a clever way, and whether or not the meaning comes out to be profound is a secondary consideration, right? So I just want the words to rhyme or sound similar. But when I pick words that sound similar, I'm no longer in charge of how the meaning's going to come together. Or I may have to make compromises on the meaning. What I'm trying to say, in other words, is when we communicate, there's style and there's substance, right? The style with which you speak is the words you choose to say that sound good, right? That the sounds of them, literally the sounds, not the meanings, but the sounds of them are good. Or like, for example, think of someone who's trying to make rhymes. That's an easy example. If somebody's trying to make rhymes, they're just trying to pick words that sound good at the end, right? But when they pick the word that sounds like it rhymes with the last line, that word may not be the best meaning. Other words were closer to the intention of the meaning, but if they use that, it won't rhyme as well, right? So they compromise the meaning, so the rhyme scheme keeps going, right? Or they might even change their lyrics to fit the rhyme, and the meanings they wanted to say will get compromised altogether. So that's the way you would describe that in linguistics or in literary terms is they're more concerned with style and less concerned with substance. When somebody's writing an essay or they're writing a book or something like that, they're really concerned about the message they're going to communicate, right? So they may use difficult words sometimes or have super long sentences to get an idea across because they're overly concerned with substance and they're not as concerned with what? Style. So in communication, those are two things, style and substance. And actually, effective communication marries the two of them together. Somebody with an effective communication style or an artistic communication style is compelling. You want to listen to them. You want to hear what they have to say. They captivate you. And if they're able to combine both of those elements, that's a very powerful, communication ability. What the Quran does here in Ya Asafa ala Yusuf, sadness, oh my sadness over Yusuf. The word sadness, not in English, but in Arabic, sounds almost like Yusuf. So Asafa, Yusuf. Those two words stylistically have been brought together. And that's really remarkable because this entire story is about Yusuf's sadness. And this is the entire story about Yusuf's sadness in his own life and sadness over Yusuf in the life of Yaqub alayhi salam. And so those two words have been fused together in this remarkable way. The other interesting thing is in Arabic, when you use possession, when you say my something, then you use the e pronoun suffix. It's an attached pronoun, a dhamir muttasil at the end. So we say, for example, in du'as Rabbi, right? My master. Or dini, my deen. The e at the end makes it my. Rasuli, my messenger. Simple Arabic, right? The e at the end. But in a very hyperbolized, very extreme case, you don't use the e at the end to express my. You use a. So he doesn't say ya asafi. He actually says ya asafa, which is a very hyperbolized. Hyperbole, if it's a big word for you, that's okay. I'll make it simple. Hyperbole means an extreme way of communicating something. Like if you're saying something that's not normal, it's not like, said in a normal tone, there's an extreme emotion behind it. That form of speech is hyperbole. Okay. It's not the same as exaggeration. I wouldn't use the word exaggeration because exaggeration means it's no longer truthful. So when you say somebody's exaggerating, that means they're adding something to the truth that isn't true, that isn't accurate. So exaggeration is not, some people use this as the exaggerated expression. I don't call it exaggeration because in the Quran, there is no exaggeration. There is hyperbole though. There's an extreme form of expression. So Ya Asafa is him crying out in extreme pain. And this is someone who held in quite a bit. As we will see by the end of this ayah, فَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ, he kept a lid on his emotions for a long time. But this is a moment which the ayah began not by describing how patient he is. And by the way, we've already read Sabrun Jamil, right? So we have to combine all of this together and understand what's happening with this remarkable prophet in this moment. And that's being captured by Allah. Actually, I'll break some of the surprise to you. There's almost a riddle here in these two ayat. Why? Because in the previous ayah, we saw how he's going to hold on to this beautiful thing Allah has given, sabr. And we also saw that he has hope in Allah that his family will be reunited. So those two things were about optimism, being hopeful, and they were about being strong in your faith and relying on Allah. Innahu huwal alimul hakim, right? Now, when you have that on the one hand, and you use the word jamil, and we talked about jamil being, patience in which you don't cry out and you don't lose your composure, etc., etc. We talked about some of that stuff already. But in this next ayah, you seem to get this feeling that he's crying out. Oh, my sadness over Yusuf. And he's just crying. There's tears rolling down his eyes. He's wailing. He's very loud when he says this. The harfun nida here is actually expressing that it's not some small expression that he's making. And I want you to just visualize this scene. His sons are in front of him. They've given him this news. He's told them off. He talked about his sabr with Allah, and he turns back hopeless. He's still devastated. He turns back and he cries out over Yusuf. And the first question that arises is, why is he crying over Yusuf? Yusuf isn't the one who just got lost. Binyamin got lost and another brother stayed behind in Egypt. How come he's not mentioning them? How come he's mentioning Yusuf alayhi salam? It's remarkable that even though the advent of modern psychology is maybe a little bit over a century old, our scholars, in the Islamic tradition, like Fakhruddin al-Razi and others, looked at this and tried to understand the psychological basis of what's happening here. And this had something that we nowadays call triggers. Like one traumatic event triggers a past, traumatic event. And it's as if you're reliving that event all over again. So he described it like this. And it's pretty amazing that he said this, because you would find somebody who studied therapy and who studied psychology extensively would probably say something very similar today. And this was said centuries ago in analyzing these ayat. He said, when you experience an extreme form of sadness that replicates, that makes you relive an older form of sadness, an older tragedy, then that tragedy comes back as if it has happened just now. So your trauma comes back and hits you, it triggers you as if you're reliving that moment all over again. And that's what's happened to him. He also said that when he lost Yusuf, Yusuf was from a different wife, right? From Rachel, according to the Bible. And Binyamin is from that same wife. So you can imagine they have similar features. So when he sees Binyamin, he sees a reflection of who in him all the time? Yusuf. Like he's got this grief of Yusuf. He can never forget Yusuf, but there's a glimpse of Yusuf still left in the home, which is who? Binyamin. And when even Binyamin is gone, then the glimpse of Yusuf is also gone. So he's reliving the loss of Yusuf all over again. And it's as if he's saying, one Yusuf was gone and I had another one. So he's actually combining the Binyamin and Yusuf and personifying them as one. The other remarkable thing about this phrase, and this is a style that's used in a couple of places in the Quran, Ya waylata, Ya asafa, this extended alif at the end. It's used almost to personify, and I realize I'm using big words today, but you guys got to get used to this. I'll make them simple, I promise. It's used to personify abstract ideas. Now let's put that in simple words. Sadness is an idea. Sadness is not a person, right? But when you say Ya asafa, oh, my sadness, as if you're calling it, like you call a person, like you call someone who came over. And as he's walking away from his sons, as if this companion of his that came to visit him at the time he lost Yusuf, that visitor of his, which is the sadness is like a person that came to visit him, has come to visit him again. That same visitor that came to me when I heard that Yusuf is gone or he's been killed by a wolf, that same terrible visitor that came and wouldn't leave me is here again. He's here haunting me again. Ya asafa ala Yusufa. So he personified that remarkable sadness that he felt in this phrase. So he says, Ya asafa Yusufa. And in this word, first, the questions that arise are very, very straightforward. Why is it that he doesn't have the fortitude, you could argue, and I'm playing devil's advocate right now, why doesn't he have the fortitude to stand his ground and talk to his sons? He's walking away. How is that sabr? Sabr means persevere. Why isn't he persevering and standing there? And then sabr means that you trust Allah will take care. Everything will turn out beautifully. We saw that in the last session. So why is he so sad? If he's already relied on Allah and he's hopeful with Allah, how can you be hopeful with Allah about everything's gonna be okay? And then he's crying and wailing in this extreme way at the same time. How can both of these things coexist? This is the Quran's beautiful, remarkable way of teaching humanity, teaching a believer the balance between our spiritual needs and our spiritual life and our emotional needs and our emotional life. And those are two very distinct things that happen inside of us. I have a need to connect to Allah to cope with whatever I'm going through. There's a spiritual part of us that is necessary to deal with life's struggles. It's absolutely necessary. And that's inside Sabrun Jameel. And that's inside his optimism that hopefully Allah will make everything work out. And I will rely on Allah's knowledge and Allah's wisdom. That's a spiritual need. If that isn't there, we would have a devastated life. Like that, just like food is a need, drink is a need, just like these things are needs, the Quran is actually teaching us this side of spirituality to deal with difficult circumstances, to find Allah in those moments, and to find your ability to have sabr rooted in your faith in Allah, is actually a need. And without that need, you would find yourself in devastation. There would be nothing beautiful left. So at least you have sabr jameel. But even though your spiritual life, your life as a believer, helps you, not drown in that situation, that still doesn't mean you're out of the storm. That still doesn't mean your emotions are all dealt with, like your sadness and your anger and your frustration and your remorse over what's happened, or the trauma that keeps coming back and gets re-triggered, that all of that has now disappeared because you have iman or because you have sabr jameel. No, those two can coexist. Another remarkable way to look at it, it's really profound, is a believer has optimistic hope in the future, right? Which is what's illustrated in the previous ayah. But at the very same time, it doesn't mean that the scars of the past disappeared. You see? And the scars of the past do not allow you to become hopeless in the future. For a lot of people, the scars of the past make them hopeless in the future. No, you can hold on to your scars in the past. Maybe they're not letting you go. Like this visitor that comes and visits him. This is a scar from the past, isn't it? But that scar from the past is not making him hopeless in the future. So you've got two extremes. You've got people that don't want to think about their past, or want to let go of their past, or run from their past. Well, the thing about the past is, like an injury, something will trigger that muscle. Maybe you moved in the wrong way, and that muscle that was always injured is going to pinch you all of a sudden again, isn't it? You're human. So no matter how much you avoid it, eventually you might have to face that emotion that's been repressed for so long. So even if you're optimistic about the future, it doesn't mean you and I can entirely escape our past. It also means that because he has such a disastrous past, years and years of crying over Yusuf alayhi salam, and that's happened, and he's been living in that state. That doesn't mean that he, another day of sadness, then another day of sadness, then another day of sadness, and he thinks tomorrow will be sad also, because I've had so many hundreds and thousands of days that are sad, so tomorrow will be sad also. He doesn't see it that way. He sees Asallahu an ya'tiyani bihim jami'a. He sees every morning as a new hope, every morning as a new start. That's how he sees it as a believer. So it's this really difficult balance that Yaqub alayhi salam has struck while dealing with his grief, and he even expresses his grief. And actually, what this means in this ayah is that it came to a point, what they, in English, they use the phrase, the straw that broke the camel's back. That's the phrase they use, right? The Quran uses a phrase called farat an-nur, when the kettle boiled over, right? And the idea behind that being, sometimes you've been taking it, you've been strong, and you've kept your composure, and you're dealing with it as best you can, but you're not breaking. But then something happens that triggers you so bad that all that time that you were holding strong and not breaking, you collapse. This is the emotional collapse of Yaqub alayhi salam, where the cry just comes out. And this grief, this cry is so extreme, it's so exhaustive, and it's so powerful that something happens to his eyesight. That وَبْيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ, and his eyes became white. What that means, it's an expression for losing your eyesight. Figuratively, some have interpreted this to mean that his eyes became white means he lost the color of his eyes by crying so much. It's a figure of speech of how much he cried. It's not literally he became blind. But the later expressions in the surah make it pretty clear that he actually, in fact, did lose his eyesight by crying. Now, this sounds like some supernatural event, right? Where he cried, and as a result of crying, he became blind. And I was thinking about, the Mufassirun talk about how, Ibn Ashur and others, that he's been crying for many years, but it's been doing its damage all this time. It's the crying has been doing its damage. But this one event was too much of a combination of previous triggers and new ones. And the grief was so much that it physically impacted him and he lost his eyesight. Now, you would think, well, from a medical point of view, that doesn't make any sense. And how does somebody cry and lose their eyesight? That's a bit extreme, or it's hard to believe, etc. And because now we have modern scientific sensibilities, so we think these things are less believable because These are, I mean, I've never heard of anybody crying so much that they went blind and things like that. But you know, it's remarkable that we as believers, when we read this, we absolutely believe it. And then in the scientific age and in the medical age, research comes along and phenomenon come along that actually, interestingly, doctors can't explain still, but they document it. You know how there are physical ailments and symptoms that exist right now that you can go get tested for, and all the tests come clear, and they can't explain what happened. And there are plenty of disorders like that where you go to the physician and you say, this is what I'm experiencing. And they say, okay, well, let's run these standard tests. And they run through all the tests. Oh, you're perfectly fine. No, I'm not fine. I'm in excruciating pain. What do you mean I'm fine? Well, all the tests came back positive. So according to what I learned in school and the textbook, you're fine. There's more to the reality of the spiritual and the emotional and the physical reality of a human being than what we know. There's more to it. And the other important thing here is, what is Allah telling us? That emotional pain and emotional trauma can have physical side effects, right? At least some of that we know now. Like, you know, my dad, not a few years ago, had heart surgery, right? And when he was diagnosed with, you know, clogged arteries and all of that, there was extensive, you know, advice given about not only his diet, but don't put yourself in stressful situations. Don't, you know, if you're depressed about something, you need to deal with that. Don't become overly sad, overly grieving, overly angry, overly anxious, etc., because it has direct impact on him. There are people whose skin breaks out when they get anxiety. You know, there are people that can break out into fevers. There are all kinds of symptoms can happen because of emotional triggers. Physically, there's no virus, there's no bacteria, there's no change of temperature in the room, but people are experiencing physical disorders because of what's happening emotionally. Heart palpitations, difficulty breathing, tightness of chest, symptoms like asthma, and the person has no asthma, you know? So I was thinking about that and what this could be, and actually Sheikh Suhaib brought this up because somebody brought this to his attention. There's actually something called conversion disorder that's been documented. So I'm going to read this to you guys. And this is actually from a CDC website, so it's from the government, which means it's less reliable. I don't know. Okay. Conversion disorder is a disorder in which a person experiences blindness, paralysis, or other symptoms affecting the nervous system that cannot be explained solely by a physical illness or injury. Symptoms usually begin suddenly after a period of emotional or physical distress or psychological conflict. Conversion disorder is thought to be caused by a body's reaction to a stressful physical or emotional event. Some research has identified potential neurological changes that may be related to symptoms of the disorder. Diagnosis of this conversion disorder is based on identifying particular signs that are common among people with the disorder, as well as performing tests to rule out other causes of symptoms. Treatment may include psychotherapy, hypnosis, stress management training, sabr, stress management training to help reduce symptoms. Treatment of any underlying psychological disorder is also recommended. The affected body part may require physical or occupational therapy until the symptoms resolve. So if the trauma is resolved, then the symptoms are resolved. So if the stress is gone, then the eyesight will come back. It's not a permanent disorder. What's going to happen in this story? When he feels the shirt, and he can feel the scent of his son, Yusuf, that he used to hug all the time. The stress is gone, and the eyesight's going to come back. Isn't that something incredible? So it is an observable phenomenon. Allah is describing here, and he's telling us something so beautiful and powerful, that people that have the strongest faith, like prophets, alayhim salam, even they can experience so much sadness and so much grief that it can blind them. It can literally impair them physically. They can be that traumatized. No one, our faith does not make us immune to sadness. It doesn't. You'll still experience it. I will still experience it. Then what's the point of having iman and what's the point of having sabr? Well, the point of having iman and sabr is, as overwhelming as those situations will be, you'll be able to navigate through them. It won't get rid of the pain, but you'll be able to pass through it. The journey won't be, it won't be impossible. It'll still be difficult. Without iman, the journey becomes impossible. But with Iman, the journey it stays difficult, but at least you can pass through it. Allah does not, and after that difficulty, Allah will bring ease, and that's our hope in Allah Azza wa Jal anyway. Okay, so here, وَتَوَلَّى عَنْهُمْ وَقَالَ يَا أَسَفَى عَلَى يُوسُفَ. In this ayah, there's also a really amazing lesson for us, because we sometimes become more Islamic than Islam, and I take every opportunity I can to highlight these things, because sometimes I see people speaking in the name of our religion, our faith, especially within family, and say things that just aren't true. Allah does not expect us to become angels just because we have Islam. If a mother lost her child and 2-3 years later she's sitting there crying and she's calling his name and she's overwhelmed, she's having an incident, and she's having an episode of that trauma of losing her child, and you say, have sabr, what's wrong with you? Just have sabr. He's like the Quran's role model for sabr. He's the one who said sabrun jameel. And these words are so powerful that these words were then told to the Prophet ﷺ by Allah himself. Fasbir sabran jamila. So the fact that he can cry out and wail over a child he lost so many years ago, and cry so much that finally his eyes have even stopped working and he's got into a physical disorder because of it, doesn't mean he doesn't have sabr. Actually, he has beautiful sabr. His sabr means he did not lose his faith in Allah. His sabr doesn't mean that he no longer feels sadness or can't express it anymore. It's an incredible thing. And we tell people, unfortunately, when they're crying or when they're wailing, why don't you have sabr? That's not fair. Because Allah didn't say to Yaqub alayhi salam, you should have better sabr than that. If Allah didn't criticize him, who are we to? If Allah acknowledged his pain like he did in an ayah of the Quran, like Allah acknowledges our emotional suffering in the Quran. And this is an example of that. It's a powerful example of that. Allah doesn't just teach us about faith and connection to Him and reliance on Him and believing in the unseen. Allah from the unseen tells us how He sees our pain. And He knows what we go through and how bad it can be and how physically impairing it can be. And how somebody else, not even a doctor, might be able to diagnose your pain. But you know that pain exists, and now you know Allah knows that pain exists. And Allah acknowledged that pain in Yaqub alayhi salam. This ayah is a profound gift of Allah to anybody going through sadness. وَابْيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ وَمِنَ الْحُزْنِ. And out of sadness, his eyes became white. So he lost his pupils started turning white, meaning he started losing his sight. But then the ayah concludes, فَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ. For he had always been someone who swallows. What is kadhim? Kadhama in Arabic actually is used for the lid on something. When you try to suppress something from coming out, that's actually a kidhama. And the idea of kadhama for like a camel, when it chews on something and it barely gulps it down to the point where it's stuck in its throat and it's blocking air passage, that's actually kadhama for a camel. The idea of kadhama came up when I was doing a dars of Surah Ali Imran, al-kadhimin al-ghayz. Quran describes, I translated it roughly as those who swallow anger, right? But those who block anger from coming out with something that they keep stuck here. What Allah is describing about Yaqub alayhi salam is he's been suppressing the great extent of his trauma and holding it in and holding these cries in and holding these overwhelming emotions in for a very long time. But finally, the stage came where he just couldn't take it, and this happened. And Allah is saying it's not just this outburst. Allah is telling us this outburst, how come he acted like that? Allah is telling us his eyes didn't just become white overnight. And that happened for he has been kadhim for a long time. He's been carrying this for a very, very long time. He's been suppressing it and holding it in so his children wouldn't see it. They wouldn't feel bad. He's like, they're gone, they're done what they've done. I don't want to make them continuously feel guilty that they'll ruin, they'll develop even more hatred or go even down the wrong path. So he's suppressed himself and suppressed those feelings for a long time, but he couldn't hold it in anymore. Something I held off from telling you about this ayah, there's now time to share, is unique usage of the word asaf. Remember I said, oh, my sadness over Yusuf in the beginning? So Allah used the word asaf, and then in the end of the ayah, he used the word huzn. which is sadness also. So there are two different words for sadness being used inside this ayah. So I wanted to take some time to explain to you the meaning of the word asaf, which is the more unique word. Huzn is used, I believe, 42 times in the Quran. Verbal conjugation is otherwise, right? So it's a more common term, and the more umum, like it's the ta'meem of the feeling, meaning it's the more universal expression of sadness. The most common term for sadness in Arabic and in the Quran is huzn, right? And it's over what has already happened. So when, by the way, when his eyes became sad or became white over what has happened, or what sadness meaning back in Yusuf and now Binyamin combined, right? But let's talk a little bit about asaf. And I'm going to read something to you. This is a really great resource. Usually when I look for synonyms in the Quran, like words that are similar, especially when they occur in the same ayah or in the same expression, there's a principle in Arabic, إِذَا اجْتَمَعَا تَفَرَّقَا. When two similar words are used close to each other, then the point is to highlight that they are in fact different, that they're not interchangeable. There is a difference between them, right? So it's an important study to look at what is otherwise synonyms, meaning they're interchangeable words, but in fact you should consider them near synonyms, almost synonyms. A good word in Arabic is mutaradifat, which is Abdurrahman Kilani's Urdu book, Mutaradifat al-Quran, words that follow one another. Like they're part of the same theme, but they're all different also, right? So there's different words in the Quran for anger. There's different words for love. There's different words for, a light, etc. Right? So sometimes you have multiple words for the same thing, and each word highlights something else, right? So now there are two words for sadness being used here. The more unique of them is asaf. So I didn't find much in his entry on in Mutaradifatul Quran with Abdurrahman Kilani, but Sheikh Suhaib read to me today Mu'jam al-Furuq al-Dalaliyya, which is a really cool contemporary dictionary also of linguistic differences between similar words. So he bunches, a bunch of Quran words that are used for sadness: al-asaf, al-asa, al-bath, al-huzn, al-hasra. So he's got a bunch of them there, but I'm going to read to you his entry on al-asaf and translate that for you. Al-asafu fi al-lugha al-mubalaghatu fi al-huzni wal-ghadab. Asaf linguistically means the extreme state of sadness and anger combined. So now he's putting two emotions, not one, right? The extreme state of sadness and anger combined. وردت هذه الكلمة في 5 مواضع من القرآن الكريم، منها ولما رجع موسى إلى قومه غضبان أسفا قال بئس ما خلقتموني من بعدي أو خلفتموني من بعدي فلعلك باخع نفسك على آثارهم إن لم يؤمنوا بهذا الحديث أسفا. So this word occurs in the Quran 5 times. For example, when Musa alayhi salam came back from the meeting with Allah and he found that they were worshipping the idol, the calf. They built calf and worshipping it. He came back ghadbana, extremely angry, asifan. This word asifan is used to describe his feelings, which is a combination of sadness and anger together. Similarly, it's used to describe the state of the Prophet ﷺ. Are you going to kill yourself in grief over the consequences of what they do? This is in the beginning of Surah Al-Kahf. اختلف المفسرون في معنى الأسف. People that interpret the Quran and explain the Quran, the mufassirun, have had differences of opinion about what asaf means. Al-asaf, فقال بعضهم الأسف أشد الغضب. So some of them have said that asaf is the most extreme form of anger. وقال بعضهم الحزن, and some of them said it's sadness. وقال بعضهم الجزع, and some of them said it's a state of feeling helpless. وقال بعضهم التلهف, and some of them said that it refers to anxiety. واحتج القائلون بأن الأسف هو الغضب. And those who say that asaf means anger, remember one group said that it means anger, they go back to something Allah says, فَلَمَّا آسَفُونَا انْتَقَمْنَا مِنْهُمْ فَأَغْرَقْنَاهُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. When they caused, Allah says about himself, when they caused us asaf, we took revenge from them and drowned all of them. He's referring to the pharaohs, yeah? So he used the word asaf, so they say, well, when they angered Allah, that's when Allah did this. So therefore asaf must mean angered. واحتج القائلون بأن الأسف هو الحزن. And those who say that asaf actually means sadness, they use evidence found in the hadith of Aisha, بحديث عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها قالت, that she said, إن أبا بكر رجل أسيف, that Abu Bakr is a man that is asif, meaning he carries a lot of sadness. So she described Abu Bakr as a man, or the hadith is asif. Now Abu Bakr clearly wasn't an angry man, right? But he did carry deep sadness over the loss of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. وجمع الواحدي بين الغضب والحزن في معنى الأسف. Al-Wahidi thus combines the meanings of anger and sadness in the meaning of the word asaf. فقال والقولان متقاربان. He went on to say that these two are very close to each other. لأن الغضب من الحزن, because anger is rooted in sadness. والحزن من الغضب, and sometimes sadness is rooted in anger. So they are so intricately connected to each other. So both dimensions are there. فإذا جاءك ما تكره ممن هو دونك غضبت وإذا جاءك ممن هو فوقك حزنت. And so if something you don't like happens to you from someone who is under you, you'll get angry. But if something you don't like happens from someone who's above you, you'll get sad. So, you'll get upset. You'll get upset if the government gives you whatever grief, and you'll get angry if your child messes with you. فَتُسَمَّى إِحْدَى هَاتَيْنِ الْحَالَتَيْنِ غَضَبًا وَالْأُخْرَى حُزْنًا. And so one of these states will be called anger, the other grief. So he combines the two of them. وفسر الزمخشري الأسف بأنه أشد الحزن والحسرة والجزع. Now we're getting to the final conclusion. Zamakhshari explains that asaf is بأنه أشد الحزن والحسرة والجزع is actually the most extreme form of sadness, regret, and helplessness مع دوام تلك الحال بصاحبها واستمرارها وإن تقادم عهدها. Not only is it the most extreme form of sadness and grief and hopelessness, but along with those feelings, it's a feeling that stays for a very long time. It's a prolonged feeling. You can't have asaf for a moment. You can have ghadab for a moment. He's arguing asaf is depression can be for many years, for example, or somebody can carry anxiety for many years. It almost becomes a psychological state. So asaf is like a psychological state. Somebody lives with it for many years. وَذَلِكَ فِي كَلَامِهِ عَلَى قَوْلِ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. And he uses this ayah that we're studying as evidence, because he called asaf, and then Allah described he's been swallowing for a long time. He's been bottling it down for a long time. So he actually uses this ayah as evidence to what he's saying. وَالْقَوْلُ مَا قَالَ الزَّمَخْشَرِي. And the right position is what Zamakhshari said. فَسِيَاقُ الْآيَاتِ يُؤَكِّدُ هَذَا الْمَعْنَى. Because the context of the ayat, 5 ayat in which asaf is found, reinforce this meaning. فَإِنَّ حُزْنَ يَعْقُوبَ عَلَى يُوسُف عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ كَانَ حُزْنًا شَدِيدًا تَطَاوَلَ عَهْدُهُ. That the grief that Yaqub felt over Yusuf alayhi salam is a grief that was extreme and lasted a very long time. وَبَلَغَ بِهِ الْجَزَعِ. And he felt incapacitated, helpless. أَنْكُفَّ بَصَرُهُ. And to the point where his sight stopped working. إِلَى آخِرِ مَا هُوَ مَعْرُوفٌ مِنْ قِصَّةِ يُوسُف. Until the end of what is known from the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. As for Allah's word, now what doesn't fit with sadness is what Allah says, when they caused us asaf, we took revenge, right? So how do you make Allah sad? You can make Allah angry, but how do you make Allah sad? That sounds inappropriate for Allah, which is why they use the word asaf to interpret as anger. So he says, let's deal with that ayah too. So فَقَدْ نُقِلَ فِيهِ تَفْسِيرًا لِابْنِ عَبَّاسِ. There are two opinions of Ibn Abbas that have been documented about this ayah. رضي الله تعالى عنهما. أحدهما أغضبونا. One meaning of asafuna in that ayah is they made us angry. والثاني أحزنوا أولياءنا المؤمنين. So beautiful. They made our believing friends, meaning Allah says they made our believing friends sad. And Allah Azza wa Jal feels for his believers. So when they made us sad, Allah is not telling us that he made Allah sad. He's saying he made Allah's believers sad. They made Allah's believers sad. They upset Allah's believers. أَسَفُ أَوْلِيَاءَنَا الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. فَالْأَسَفْ هُنَا يَحْتَمِلُ الْمَعْنَيَيْنِ الْغَضَبُ الْحُزْنِ. So here asaf also carries both meanings, anger from Allah and sadness from those who they upset among the believers. وَلِذَلِكَ يُمْكِنُنَا أَن نَقُولَ. And that's why we can say, إن الأسف في القرآن الكريم يجمع بين عدة معان. That the word asaf in the Quran, the noble Quran, combines a number of themes: al-huzn, sadness, wal-ghadab, anger, wal-jaz', helplessness, wa-dawamu hadhihi al-hala wa shiddatuha, and two more things. So sadness, anger, helplessness, and the fact that all of these three would last for a very long time and they would be very extreme. Now this is important because when you feel something for a long time, you get used to it, right? If you're dealing with pain for a long time, there's something called pain management. You just kind of you develop a deeper threshold. If you've had a toothache for a few months, it kind of becomes a little more bearable to deal with, right? But so your body starts adjusting or not being as sensitive to that pain. But it seems that from asaf, even though it's a long time, its intensity remains. So, which is now evidenced in the ayah, Yusuf has been gone for many years, but Yaqub alayhi salam is feeling the intensity of his loss as if it just happened. Ya asafa ala Yusufa wa biyaddat aynahu min al-huzni fahuwa kadhim. The deep sadness of this man. Allah acknowledging his bond with him, with Allah. So he's going to have his hopes and optimism with Allah, and then Allah acknowledges the sadness, the deep sadness of his heart, and dedicated an entire ayah just to his sadness. Just this whole ayah is just about the three expressions of his sadness. Actually four. Him turning away from his sons. That's not a small thing. And then, because how many feelings come with turning away? You don't know how much you've hurt me. You know how much it hurts me to have to turn away from you? You know? Because he doesn't want to turn away from his sons. There's a lot of negative emotions that he has to deal with even as he's turning away. Then him crying out over that son that he lost so many years ago. Then on top of that, his eyes becoming white. So there's the physical pain on top of the emotional pain. And then Allah acknowledging, and he's been swallowing this for so many years. Like one dimension after another, of the state of Yaqub alayhi salam's sadness, and an entire ayah dedicated to that is a profound thing to me. Like if this ayah wasn't even mentioned by Allah, and you kept on with the story, you wouldn't have noticed that it's something missing. Like this is not a pivotal part of the storytelling. Like, oh, let's just only mention the things that will move the story forward. This doesn't move the story forward. There are so many other details that Allah decided to skip. And here's a detail Allah decided to emphasize. All to teach us the power, the debilitating power of sadness, and how a believer must learn to balance that with their faith in Allah. So the faith will remain beautiful while the ugliness of sadness is being dealt with. Barakallahu li wa lakum fil Qur'an al-Hakim wa nafa'ani wa iyyakum bil ayati wa dhikr al-Hakim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.